Good evening, everybody. I'm going to give it about a minute. Um, See if more people show up. Hopefully, I'm being heard. Um, how's everyone doing? Hope you're doing well. Um, the topic tonight is an important one. Um, Talk about the greater geopolitical aspects of 9/11 and how they came to fruition. Um, I always talk about the technical details, but tonight we talk about the important aspects of foreign policy and who they're led by. Uh, and I think this is important because what we're seeing today in the Middle East, involving the United States, the Gulf, which is basically Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, and Israel, the policies that are happening now were the policies that were outlined in the late 80s and 1990s. And the individuals who were part of an organization called the Neoconservatives. And I'm going to talk in depth about the agendas of these people, the documents and foreign policy outlines and guidelines, as well as the ideologies and the definitions thereof. So we'll start with the just hours after the September 11, 2001 attacks. There was a high level meeting of the principals involved with the State Department and the Pentagon. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, Richard Myers, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Secretary of State Colin Powell, and others, in which a high level meeting took place in the evening hours of September 11, 2001. And they were talking about how the nation should respond. In the days leading up to that meeting, when they find out that Al Qaeda was somehow involved with the terrorist attacks, a small faction, radical faction, whom are entitled neocons or neoconservatives, had begun discussing about attacks on Iraq before the evidence was even coming in. I'm not talking about weeks or months from now. It was just days, 2 or 3 days after the September 11th attacks. People like Richard Pearl, who would whisper in the ear of Director Tenet of the CIA to Richard Clarke of the National Counterterrorism Council in how can we tie the events to Iraq. The initial party led by President Bush, by the way, because these are the people who influenced President Bush. President Bush went to Director of the FBI, Robert Mueller, first, and told him to find a link between Al Qaeda and Saddam Hussein, who was the president of Iraq. They could not. And Mueller didn't want to be part of the task, what the neoconservatives wanted. So Bush went to Director Tenet instead. Meanwhile, other neocons like Paul Wolfowitz, the Undersecretary of Defense, Douglas Feith from the Office of Special Plans, Richard Pearl, William Crystal, Robert Kagan, and a couple of others. You may have heard these names. But who are these people that can have such influence inside the White House at the time? Well, to understand who these people are and what they're about, we have to return back to a point in time. So, who are the neocons? Well, there's an ideology called neoconservative, but the group that was involved with the Bush White House, people like Donald Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney, Paul Wolfowitz, Richard Pearl, Douglas Feith, William Crystal, Robert Kagan, and others. Some of these people came out of the Leo Strauss school. Leo Strauss was a German American political philosopher, um, a classical political philosophy teacher. And Leo Strauss was an important individual to most of these people. His students were numerous: Hadley Arks, Roger Masters, Paul Wolfowitz, Stanley Rosen, Abraham Shulsky, the director of the Office of Special Plans, which I'll describe in full in a bit, Stephen Smith, Murray Dry, and Charles Butterworth. And a lot of these people would influence others as well. Leo Strauss once asserted that the crisis of the West consists in the West having become uncertain of its purpose. And due to the democratic principles throughout the 1960s, Strauss's solution was a restoration of the vital ideas and faith in the past, which had sustained the moral purpose of the West. Now, this would cater to the Catholics, evangelical Christianity. And he argued that the founding fathers were correct in their understanding of the classics in the pursuit and principles of justice. After this, the leading proponents, the leading students of Leo Strauss began embarking on political careers. One of them was Jeane Kirkpatrick. Jeane Kirkpatrick, who was an American diplomat and political scientist who served under the Reagan administration. She was an ardent anti-communist, as most of these revisionist neoconservatives are. And she was also a Democrat. Now, some of you may be saying that, well, neoconservatives are usually Republican, and this is a falsehood. There are neoconservatives who are Democrats. It's an ideology that is majorly pertained to the Republican Party, but you do have Democrats who are Dinos, Democrat in name only, just like you heard the description of rhinos, Republican in name only. And if you haven't known by now, Democrats and Republicans don't exist. The divisive political paradigms, when it comes to the greater, more important goals of the American and the establishment imperialists, there's only one party, and that is those in power. They're not divisive when it comes to the Pentagon. They're not divisive when it comes to Israel. And I'll get to that in a minute. Jeane Kirkpatrick concluded during the late 1980s that the United States should encourage liberalization and democracy in autocratic countries. During the 1990s, she was an advisor, even under the Bush president. and her respect regarding the neoconservative outlines that she was responsible for, such as the um, a publication for Commentary Magazine in 1979 entitled Dictatorships and Double Standards, in which it was an essay outlining in which she argued that rapid liberalization in traditional autocratic countries had delivered anti-American opposition groups. Countries such as China, the Soviet Union, Iran, and so forth. Her essay was supported by the Leo Strauss students like Paul Wolfowitz and later Richard Pearl. Through her and through her work, the revisionist neoconservatives began to become situated in the federal government under the Reagan administration. Throughout the early 1980s, we saw certain individuals who would become influential, such as Dick Cheney, who was the United States Secretary of Defense under George H.W. Bush from 1989 to 1993. We saw Donald Rumsfeld, who later became the White House Chief of Staff from 1974 to 1975, and later the Secretary of Defense. Paul Wolfowitz served as the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy from 1989 to 1993 under H.W. Bush Sr. And slowly, this faction would begin to gain power throughout the late 1980s, early 90s. What Dick Cheney wanted was a return to the Nixon era in which hard right policies, ultra conservatism, and the need to spread Western democracy, or his version of it, influenced by Leo Strauss, to not just become the primary force of the world, but also be protective of another country that shares similar values to the United States on a political structure. And that is Israel. Israel is led by Zionism, or, in to be technical, revisionist Zionism. What is revisionist Zionism? It was an ideology created by Ze'ev Jablonski, who was a Russian Jewish poet and author, who advocated for a revision of the Zionism that was created by Theodore Herzl, or practical Zionism. Revisionist Zionism focused on the setting of the land of Israel by independent individuals instead of government. They believed that Israel does not recognize the Palestinians, and that the country is to expand beyond the borders of Jordan and Lebanon. This ideology fit perfectly with the neoconservatives' outlook, but the neoconservatives weren't just content on imperialism at home, but abroad. And they thought that that way of life would resonate with other countries, and there would be a war of ideologies in time. But they knew this going in, that there would be a conflict of civilizations. This should give you an idea of the type of psychology these people are afflicted with. You could say it's narcissism, sociopathy, psychopathy. It could be a combination of all three. But they don't see human life as me and you do. They see it as chess pieces. So throughout the senior Bush administration, many of these leading principals out of the Leo Strauss School became influential members of the federal government. Another individual, not inside the United States, but in Israel, who would share similar political ideology with the neoconservatives, is Benjamin Netanyahu. Benjamin Netanyahu is part of the Likud party, which is a nationalist ideology. And when he rose to power in 1996, when he became prime minister, the Likud party won the majority of the seats in the Knesset, which is the parliament of government like Congress in the United States, for the first time in many years. And Netanyahu brought a fresher perspective of what Israel should be. And his personal thoughts regarding what Israel should be and what the Palestinians shouldn't be directly comes from an article published by Oded Yanon. And it's currently referred to as the Yanon Plan. Oded Yanon was a former advisor to Ariel Sharon, the 11th Prime Minister of Israel, and he was a former senior official with the Israeli Foreign Ministry, in which he had a blueprint for the Middle East. In order for Israel to become the design sole power of the Middle East itself, because they've been surrounded by Arab governments, majority socialist Arab governments, that posed a direct threat, not just to Israel, according to them, but also to its interests, US's interests, as well as the Gulf, which comes later. Yanon thought that the 1978 Camp Accords were mistaken, and that one of Israel's aims, according to the plan, the Yanon plan, for the 1980s, would be the dismemberment of Israel, in which he described in the Oded Yanon plan as a corpse. and he hoped to reestablish the status quo ante when Israel had controlled the Sinai Peninsula. They supported the Coptic Christian movement in Egypt, in which they would hope to overthrow or influence the government under Hosni Mubarak. They also had a blueprint for Jordan and the West Bank. Yunan's paper suggested that the policy regarding the West Bank should aim for one objective: the liquidation of Jordan under King Abdullah. Because they feared the Palestinian migration to the West Bank, because they wished to expand their borders far outside of the West Bank, no less. So Yunan thought that the dissolution of Jordan would bring an end to the problem in two ways. One, an Arab opposition, and two, the Palestinian problem. So they could keep the borders of 1967, which was outlined after the Six-Day War. And last but not least, Odin Yunan's plan concerned Iraq. And Yunan really considered Iraq, with its oil wealth, to be Israel's greatest threat. He also believed that after the Iran-Iraq war, that Iraq would be split, but they didn't. And so he wanted to destroy the Baathists in the country. This ideology of the Odin Yunan plan resonated with many of the leading neoconservatives in the George H.W. Bush administration. However, incidentally enough, the Bush family were not pro-Israel. Not senior anyway. But because of the influence of the neoconservatives later, they had basically overruled Bush, who they saw as an end-all to end-all, somebody not important. There's actually an old saying in Washington that if Dick Cheney died, Bush would become president. So that just tells you the respect that Bush Jr. got from many of these neocons in office. Through the influence of Benjamin Netanyahu, who became close friends with the United States government at this time, because he saw the government of the United States as the big brother, if you will. The power that they needed to supplant the Arab regime governments, the socialist governments, and destroy what's left. And thus, Netanyahu was a pragmatist. He was also quite a strategist as well, in that he took the Odin Yunan plan and tried to implement it as soon as he became prime minister in 1996. But he had to make friends with his enemies in order to get them closer to him. And one of them was Yasser Arafat, the leader of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Netanyahu would make false declarations and false promises of stopping, say, illegal settler homes, the bulldozing of Palestinian land, farms, schoolhouses, and homes, the discussions and promises of returning the borders pre-6 Day War. 6 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 Day War none of these promises would be met, and very few, uh, not much in the way of progress. In other words, in 1994, Paul Wolfowitz would pen the Wolfowitz Doctrine, which is the unofficial name of the Defense Planning Guideline, or I'm sorry, the Defense Planning Guidance. It was published by Paul Wolfowitz and his deputy, um, Scooter Libby. It wasn't actually meant for public release, but the New York Times broke the story in 92. I said 94. It's 1992. I'm mistaken. 1992. And the document spoke about U.S. foreign policy and defense planning guidelines. It was an imperialist doctrine in which the document outlined a policy of unilateralism and preemptive military action to suppress preconceived potential threats from other nations and prevent dictatorships from rising to superpower. Now, if you think that sounds familiar, it's a little bit different than Zbigniew Brzezinski's grand chessboard. Brzezinski was not a neoconservative, and his outlines started about how the United States needed to control Eurasia. These neoconservatives didn't care much about Eurasia, for example, they wanted the world. And Brzezinski spoke critically of the neoconservatives throughout his career. One objective in the Paul Wolfowitz doctrine was the reemergence of a new rival and how to circumvent it. Now, they were talking about, and we're not talking about the Middle East, we're basically talking about like Russia, Soviet Union, China, that a dormant consideration underlying a new defense strategy would require an endeavor to prevent hostile powers from dominating a region whose resources would be sufficient to generating global power. This was similar to Brzezinski's grand chessboard. This is the only similarity, because Brzezinski actually outlined in the grand chessboard in the book that the Carter administration needed to intervene in Afghanistan because if the Soviet Union took over Afghanistan, if the communists and the communist bloc decided to expand beyond Afghanistan, they could easily supplant Pakistan and Iran. And the goal is to take control of the Caspian Sea, the largest untapped oil reserves in the world. The doctrine established the US as the leading superpower without any compromise whatsoever. And I'm going to quote you from the document. Quote, the United States must show the leadership necessary to establish and protect a new order that holds the promise of convincing potential competitors that they need not aspire to a greater role or pursue a more aggressive posture to protect their legitimate interests in non-defensive areas. We must account sufficiently for the interests of the advanced industrial nations to discourage them from challenging our leadership or seeking to overturn the established political and economic order. We must maintain the mechanism for deferring potential competitors from even aspiring to a larger regional or global role. The doctrine also spoke about preventive intervention. Quote, while the United States cannot become the world's policeman by assuming responsibility for righting every wrong, we will retain the preeminent responsibility for addressing selectively those wrongs which threaten not only our interests, but those of our allies or friends, or which could seriously unsettle international relations. While the United States cannot become the world's policeman and assume responsibility for solving every international security problem, neither can we allow our critical interest to depend solely on international mechanisms that can be blocked by countries whose interests may be very different than our own. Where our allies' interests are directly affected, we must expect them to take an appropriate share of the responsibility and, in some cases, play the leading role. But we must maintain the capabilities for addressing selectively those security problems that threaten our own interests. So, as you can see in the outline of the Wolfowitz Doctrine, they're talking about the United States not being the sole policeman, but being the sole superpower. Underlying the doctrine is that they would be the sole policeman. And this would be echoed in another neoconservative document, which we'll get into in a bit, called the Project for New American Century. When the document was leaked to the New York Times in 1992, the United States public resoundingly was critical, saying that the document was imperialist. And so when Clinton won the election, the neoconservatives basically returned to the shadows, so to speak. Clinton considered himself a progressive, something that many people didn't share that about him. He was also a narcissist, not in the way of Donald Trump, where he was an arrogant blowhard. Uh, I've always considered Bill Clinton a sexual deviant, his wife to be a complete sociopath. And there's many, I don't need to repeat many of the rumors about the Clinton family and the people, the mysterious deaths that are connected to them. You've heard about this before. But to fast forward the Clinton administration, Netanyahu would lose the prime minister of Israel to Ehud Barak. The transition was already in the process, where Israel and the United States would now grow to be a stronger bond than at any period beforehand, even at the advent of Zionism, even with Zionism influencing American politics in the early 20th century. At no point in its history did revisionist conservatism and revisionist Zionism become more intertwined in American politics than at this point. And since the mid 90s, it has never been broken to the current day. And so the outlines of the Wolfowitz Doctrine, the Oded Yinon Plan, began to take a different shape, a much more nefarious shape. In 1997, a neoconservative think tank, which is focusing on U.S. foreign policy, called the Project for the New American Century. Many leading neocons and Zionists would be involved, not Israeli Zionists, but American Zionists. Most of these people have dual nationalism with Israel, between the United States and Israel, dual citizenship, what I'm meaning. So just when you think it's black and white, when it comes to American politics, it's mostly gray. You don't know who to believe. You don't know if there's a right or left. But like I said before, I'm hoping to make it clear that there isn't. There's just a select, amalgamous group of rich people, oligarchs, profiteers, corporatists who head and lead certain aspects of our government. The group, the Project for the New American Century, was founded by William Crystal, a neoconservative writer for the political magazine, the Weekly Standard, and Robert Kagan, who's a neocon scholar and leading advocate for liberal interventionism. He's actually a critic of U.S. foreign policy. Kagan actually disagreed with certain neocons regarding Afghanistan and Iraq. But however, Kagan did support military intervention. With Iraq and the neoconservatives outline regarding Iraq. But Kagan actually supported military intervention in Afghanistan, Syria, and Libya. And he also supports currently military invasion of Iran. So here's a liberal. Remember, I told you before that neoconservatives aren't just specifically Republican. Here's a liberal who believes in the neoconservative outlines regarding certain countries. Anyway, the stated goal of the Project for the New American Century is to promote American global leadership. Now, this is a lot different than the Oded Yonam Plan or the Wolfowitz Doctrine. Whereas Wolfowitz didn't want to be the world police, these guys basically took it to the next step. And one of the co-signers of the Project for New American Century will be Paul Wolfowitz, incidentally. They believed, William Crystal and Robert Kagan actually believed that the Republican Party lacked a compelling vision of the future of American foreign policy. They were highly critical of Clinton's foreign policy record, which was actually pretty good. And during the summer of 1996, prior to the advent of the PNAC committee, Crystal and Kagan co-authored an article in Foreign Affairs, which is basically an American magazine published by the Council of Foreign Relations. And the name of the article is Toward a Neo-Reaganite Foreign Policy, referring to the foreign policy of Reagan. Now, remember I told you most of the leading neoconservatives under the Bush administration primarily started under the Reagan administration. The article that they wrote, they argued that American conservatives were in a state of confusion regarding foreign policy in the Middle East, in Asia, and with the Soviet Union. And they advocated a more elevated version or vision of America's international role. So they suggested that the United States should adopt a stance of benevolent global hegemony. Now, the individuals who signed the PNAC document, in which 25 people signed the document, the individuals who signed this document were not employees or members of the group. They just supported the PNAC document. Many of these people who signed the document would later go on to have prominent roles in the Bush administration. And most of the foreign policy that we saw in the outline in the late 80s, early 90s, such as Oded Yinon and Wolfowitz Doctrine, and later the Project for New American Century, would be echoed in the foreign policy that we see today. Similar, not directly, but similar. Many government employees would basically call you a conspiracy theorist for even asserting that this is the truth. That's not what Wesley Clark said. Or Thomas Drake, former senior executive of the NSA. Or Colin Powell, the former Secretary of State under Bush. Or Lawrence Wilkerson, the former assistant to Secretary of State Powell. They have all come out and said that these early outlines, foreign policy documents, are playing out exactly to the T today. The Project for the New American Century, which is basically had a statement of principles. And on June 3rd, 1997, they released the statement of principles to the public. And it showed the 25 people signed with the document. And so it said that the United States should strengthen ties with its democratic allies and challenge the regimes hostile to the interests of the United States and the values, and to preserve and extend an international order friendly to United States security, prosperity, and principles, and calling for the Reaganite policy of military strength and moral clarity. And that the principles were necessary if the United States is to build on the success of the past century and to ensure the security and greatness of the future. So here you have the statement of principles outlining that the United States needed to be the moral and military strength, the moral clarity, the moral good, whatever that is defined, through military strength. This is the classic definition of imperialism. In September of 2000, PNAC released a report entitled The Rebuilding of America's Defenses. This document is actually misrepresented by the 9/11 Truth Movement. The report, which is probably the most important document of all in the PNAC paper, believed that America should seek to preserve and extend its position of global leadership by maintaining the preeminence of U.S. military forces throughout. The report also stated that advanced forms of biological warfare that can target specific genotypes may transform biological warfare from the realm of terror to a politically useful tool. That's from the own document. It also called for regime change in Iraq. Same thing that was outlined in the Odin-Yunan Plan, the Paul Wolfowitz Doctrine, and now here, the Project for New American Century. So now, as you can understand and see, why I had to define what neoconservative is and the people involved with it and the documents along with it, as well as Zionism and revisionist Zionism, and how they're interlinked when it comes to foreign policy. They share similar ideas and agendas. Now, they have a different goal. Israel has a different goal than the United States. The United States wants to be a superpower. Israel can't be a superpower. They don't have the capabilities of being one. But what they do have, what they do want, is to expand their borders outside at the current moment into the sea beyond Jordan. The Crystal and Kagan advocated regime change in Iraq and also called for the disarmament process to continue. Many of the leading names of PNAC, such as Richard Pearl, Paul Wolfowitz, James Woolsey, Elliot Abrams, Donna Rumsfeld, John Bolton, Robert Zoellick, William Crystal, were among the signatories of an open letter by PNAC to President Bill Clinton calling for the forced removal, not the removal, the forced removal of Saddam Hussein. The audacity of this non-government agency who has enormous influence in American politics to force a president, a sitting president, to make a foreign policy decision using the U.S. military on a foreign power. I'm hoping I'm making it clear just how powerful these people are, even during the Clinton administration. This would be 10 times over when Bush became president. Clinton refused and called them a dangerous organization. He actually called them lunatics. The neocons portrayed Saddam Hussein as a threat. This was echoed by Ehud Barak, Prime Minister of Israel. They wanted to regulate the oil market. Saudi Arabia wasn't enough. Iraq had a lot of oil. He would be considered a threat, as outlined in the Odin-Yunan Plan and the Wolfowitz Doctrine. So they went to the press and started putting malicious lies about Clinton, saying that he's not a wartime president, that Iraq was posing as a nuclear threat. This was later echoed by Benjamin Netanyahu, who went before a Senate Select Committee hearing and told members of the committee that Iraq was procuring nuclear weapons. Sounds familiar? The Project for New American Century stated that American foreign policy cannot continue to be crippled by the misguided insistence or the unanimity of the UN Security Council, and they wish to bypass them in order to go to war. because they believed that the UN sanctions against Iraq were not enough, and that they were ineffective in disarming Iraq. In February of 1998, another letter was sent to Clinton, a second one. And by January of 1999, PNAC circulated a memo which was criticizing the bombing of Iraq during Operation Desert Fox as ineffective. Operation Desert Fox was a 4-day major bombing campaign in December of 1998. It didn't disarm Iraq, they said. They needed more. The forced removal of Hussein. Clinton was against it. And thus, the conspiracy surrounding Clinton's forced removal from office, stating that it was Israel that was behind it, spreading malicious rumors. There's also a rumor, which may have some validity, that the Clinton White House was being bugged by Israeli intelligence in the Amdocs investigation that later came out. At about this time, this is something I spoke about in a previous live video where we had Israeli art students that were selling cheap art, which was listing devices to the DEA and some officials of the American government and the FBI as well. When George W. Bush became president of the United States, a membership began just 1 year prior. During the summer of 1998, Bush would had a meeting with Condoleezza Rice at the behest of his father. At this time, Rice was the director of Soviet and East European affairs at the National Security Council. And he liked her. And he promised her a seat within the government when he became president, which sounded like a sure declaration to me. And in 1999, a team began, which was to be the earlier influences of the neoconservative under Leo Strauss, under Reagan. This group would call themselves the Vulcans, which is alluding to Vulcan, the Roman god of fire and metalworking. These individuals would include Richard Armitage, the Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Affairs, Stephen Hadley, Assistant Secretary of Defense for Global Strategic Affairs, Richard Pearl, Assistant Secretary of Defense for Global Strategic Affairs, Scooter Libby, Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Paul Wolfowitz, the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Condoleezza Rice, National Security Council, Dov Zakheim, the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Strategy, Plans, and Forces, and Robert Zoellick, the Counselor of the U.S. Department of State. When Bush was on the road during the presidential debates, he outlined his foreign policy plans in October of 2000, in which he said, quote, if we're an arrogant nation, they'll resent us. If we're a humble nation but strong, they'll welcome us. Our nation stands alone right now in the world in terms of power, and that's why we have to be humble and yet project strength in a way that promotes freedom. I'm not so sure the role of the United States is to go around the world and say this is the way it's got to be. We can help. And maybe it's just our difference in government, the way we view government. I want to empower the people. I want to help people help themselves and not have government tell people what to do. End quote. Many of the leading members of this group would go on to shape U.S. foreign policy forever, especially regarding the Middle East. And those foreign policy outlines, as outlined in the Wolfowitz Doctrine and the Project for New American Century, would later give way to a group of people called the Vulcans, neoconservatives, and dual nationalists between the United States and Israel. These people will go on to shape foreign policy forever. And so, from here, Bush became the president in 2001. And so, through the influence of the neocons, of the Vulcans, of the Israeli foreign policy under AIPAC, the American Israeli Public Affairs Committee, under Benjamin Netanyahu, who would later become the Prime Minister of Israel again in 2009 to 2021. That will come later. But the influence of Israel and the neocons started here, the Bush administration. The policies that were outlined in the years prior were now coming to take hold under the Bush presidency and advanced even further. But they needed something to happen. They needed something to precipitate in order to live up to the outlines and guidelines of the Bush Doctrine, of the Oded Yinon Plan, and the Project for New American Century. So Bush published the National Security Strategy of the United States, the Bush Doctrine, which is basically similar to the Wolfowitz Doctrine. The Bush Doctrine is defined as a collection of strategy principles, practical policy decisions, and a set of ideas for guiding U.S. foreign policy of the future. Bush had claimed that the United States was locked in a global war, a war in ideology, in which its enemies are bound together by that common ideology against and is against a direct threat of American democracy or their version of it. Their democracy is not similar to mine. I can tell you that. Out of the national security strategy, there are 4 points that are highlighted by Bush: preemption, military primacy, new multilateralism, and the spread of democracy. Imperialism. This document emphasized preemption, stating America is now threatened less by conquering states than we are by failing ones. The United States is menaced by less by fleets and armies than by catastrophic technology or biological weapons in the hands of terrorists. It redefined unilateralism. And it redefined terrorism, which left open terrorism to be defined vaguely. That still happens today, by the way. But like I said, they needed an event to happen in order for the guidelines of the stated papers I mentioned previously. They got one. On September 11, 2001, 4 planes were hijacked and they deliberately crashed into the World Trade Center, Pentagon, and into a field in Somerset County, Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Later on that evening, members of the National Security Council held a briefing, an emergency briefing, in a private room underneath the Pentagon. Donald Rumsfeld, Richard Myers, Stephen Cambone, members of the Joint Chiefs, were there discussing a proper response, an aggressive response to the terrorist attacks. They would later find out that the Central Intelligence Agency knew about certain hijackers living inside the United States. Now, because the response was to be against Iraq, it was up to the Central Intelligence Agency, ordered by Bush himself, to find a link between Iraq and Al Qaeda. In the days after September 11, 2001, members of the Vulcans, neoconservatives, began whispering in the ears of Bush and Dick Cheney and George Tenet about the desperate need to make Iraq the guilty party for the events of September 11, 2001. And now you know why. For those who couldn't understand why we invaded Iraq, I'm hoping this live discussion now has made it clear as to why they were pushing for Iraq. It's because of previous foreign policy guidelines and documents that called for the forced removal of Saddam Hussein. The goals outlined by the Project for a New American Century in regards to Iraq came to fruition. On March 20th, 2003, the U.S. invaded Iraq. And soon they took over the city, the capital, Baghdad. It's considered the most costliest war. And it's estimated anywhere between 800,000 to 1.5 million Iraqis have died between 2003 to 2020. A Holocaust. 1,000,000 times worse than what happened on 9/11. It didn't end there. The invasion of Afghanistan. The longest war in American history. First country invaded October 7, 2001. This was not one of the countries the neocons wished to entertain. In fact, many leading proponents of the Vulcans were against it, saying that it would take away from the war that they wanted to happen. But the Pentagon approved of this, considering that it would be the right response. Bin Laden was here, the Taliban, the alleged orchestrators of September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks. But the neocons knew better. They didn't care about bin Laden, didn't care about Al Qaeda. We saw that with the Bush administration, where they didn't entertain any briefings between the counterterrorism czar Richard Clarke at his National Security Briefing Council meetings. Didn't want to hear from him. Didn't want to hear from the FBI giving warnings 2 years prior about a nation that may be coming under attack, or the cable reports that were coming in from the counterterrorism center of the CIA, coming from field agents who are warning about an attack inside the United States, or from global leaders giving vague reports to the United States in the summer of 2001, saying that Al Qaeda is going to attack. Neocons didn't care about bin Laden, didn't care about Al Qaeda. They cared about living up to the guidelines and outlines of foreign policy reports that I previously mentioned. The CIA would end up torturing an individual by the name of Sheikh Ibn al-Libi, a Libyan national who was captured in Pakistan, sent to Egypt, and tortured mercilessly. He was actually flown also to the USS Bataan, a warship in the North Arabian Sea, which was actually holding another American converted Taliban member. Trying to remember his name, John Walker Lind. The CIA tortured him. And they tortured him. And Libby told them that he was privy to a meeting between Baathists of the Hussein regime and Al Qaeda in procuring chemical and biological weapons. The United States decided to use this information, which wasn't vetted properly, and Tenet brought that report in a briefing between the members of the United States Security Council team, which was to brief the United Nations. They asked Tenet, is this verifiable information? Tenet would end up taking a phone call, leave the table, and then come back and said, yes, use it. Years later, they would find out after the U.S. invaded Iraq that al-Libi made up the whole story. It never happened. When U.S. officials interviewed Sheikh Ibn al-Libi, why did you tell us that? He replied, I told them anything that they wanted to hear so they wouldn't hurt me anymore. There was also another report by Israeli intelligence that was also false about a meeting in Prague involving one of the 9/11 ringleaders, Mohammed Atta, meeting with Ba'athist officials regarding chemical weapons. This also turned out to be false. Judith Miller, a neoconservative herself, who would end up writing a book about the dangers of Saddam Hussein in Iraq and the threats thereof, about procuring a nuclear weapon, and about being a international terrorist supporter. I forgot the name of the book, but it was actually supported by Paul Wolfowitz and William Crystal. All of these lies come at the cost of human suffering, not just in Iraq, but in Afghanistan. But it doesn't end there, ladies and gentlemen. In September of 2002, another office was created inside the Pentagon. It's called the Office of Special Plans. Another neoconservative was involved with this. In fact, there was two, Paul Wolfowitz and Douglas Feith. This office, which was not an office that was allowed entry by anyone. Many people weren't allowed in this room, including the Secretary of State, Colin Powell. It was to supply the Bush administration with raw intelligence, unvetted, pertaining to Iraq. So mysterious and so cunning were the members of the Office of Special Plans that even the Central Intelligence Agency would later come out and say that this office is a direct threat to the U.S. national security and hegemony in the region. However, Douglas Feith actually would later say about it was a direct response to the CIA's intelligence regarding Iraq. And Feith would later, and I'll quote you what Feith said about this. Quote, it's healthy to criticize the CIA's intelligence. What the people in the Pentagon were doing was right. It was good government. No one in my office ever claimed there was an operational relationship. There was a relationship. It just didn't work with certain people. End quote. Wonder who those certain people were. In 2007, in February of 2007, the Pentagon's Inspector General report concluded that the Office of Special Plans developed, produced, and disseminated alternative intelligence assessments on Iraq and Al Qaeda's relationship, which included some conclusions that were inconsistent with the intelligence community to senior decision makers. This would be true. The FBI, the CIA saw no link between Al Qaeda and Iraq, even though, like I said before, Tenet basically lied or had the unvetted information coming from Sheikh Ibn al-Libi to be used as evidence to go to war at the United Nations Security Council. So that just tells you right there that at the senior levels of government, there's a detachment between the senior levels of government and the foot soldiers of government, if you will. Foot soldiers may be conducting themselves correct or morally correct. Debatable. But the senior levels, the deceivers, the liars, the narcissists, the sociopaths, the psychopaths, the careerists, the oligarchs. These are the people who didn't get there by working their ass off. Most of these people were brown nosers. They knew the right people and they knew how to manipulate. Afghanistan was a 20-year war, the longest in American history. Iraq led to 2 civil wars and 2 wars as well. Later, under the Obama administration, the wars that were outlined in the previous reports and documents that were partially fulfilled by Bush, were continued under Obama. The invasion of Libya, for example, the invasion of Syria, using the CIA program Timber Sycamore to fund and train the jihadists to overthrow the Bashar al-Assad government. At the same time, we were conducting the war on terror. Soldiers began tweeting in 2012, whose side are we on? Israel began nursing the members of the Jabhat al-Nusra in Golan Heights hospitals, which led to many IDF generals suggesting, even to Haaretz, a liberal paper in Israel, suggesting that we rather support the jihadists than the dangerous Assad government and the Syrian army. The Timber Sycamore project was a multi-million-dollar project, which was a project created by then General David Petraeus, supported by King Abdullah of Jordan and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel, which saw millions, hundreds of millions, supported by the Gulf, the monarchies of Bahrain and Qatar, gun running, gun sales, and the training and funding of groups like Ansar al-Islam, Jabhat al-Nusra, and later the Islamic State in Levant, and other different proxy groups that were inside Syria. All of these are foreign Arabs, trained by the intelligence apparatuses. This program ended under the Trump administration in 2017, but the damage was already done. The only thing they didn't do was Assad is still the president. However, even though that war was supported by the Obama administration, on May 16, 2014, the second Libyan civil war took place. And this war was actually pushed to Obama. Obama didn't want to entertain this war. However, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, Samantha Powers, and Susan Rice, basically the women in the White House, were pushing this war vehemently. This is actually elucidated quite nicely under Scott Horton's book, Time to End the War. In which they supported the General National Congress, which is based in Western Libya and backed by various Islamic militias from Qatar, Turkey, and Algeria. And they overthrew and even killed the president, Muammar Gaddafi, which led to a very disturbing reaction by Hillary Clinton, which was caught on camera. And to the people in this room, you probably have seen it. We came, we saw, he died. And then a cackling. Who reacts like that? Who responds gleefully at the untimely death of a foreign leader? These are the people that run our government. As of now, Libya is under still a civil war where Islamic militants that never existed before under the Gaddafi presidency are now roaming free, fighting for what little territory is left between themselves and the proposed government under the National Salvation Government, I think it's called. But they don't want freedom of rights. They don't want women's rights. They have open air slave markets. Syria itself is basically destroyed. It will take them decades to rebuild. Afghanistan, which was once a Western democracy styled country, is now in the hands of the Taliban again. So 20 years of war with the country in which we couldn't even defeat a bunch of guerrilla backed Pakistanis. Iraq, which is still reeling in the effects and the after effects of the US invasion. They still have proxy wars there as well as Iran and the Soviet Union trying to eliminate what's left of the Islamic State, which is being supported by aerial bombs of Israel and the United States. All of this, of what I've outlined today in this video, was outlined years and years ago under the Odin Plan, the Wolfowitz Doctrine, the Project for New American Century, the Bush Doctrine, and the Office of Special Plans. And that they used the events of September 11, 2001 as the pretext to live up to those doctrines and outlines, which are being fulfilled by psychopaths, sociopaths, profiteers, as well as their affiliates, such as the private military industrial complex, the Pentagon, foreign lobbyists, and the Gulf, and Israel. So I hope that this video was educational for you. And I hope that we can together spread the more important message of what needs to be addressed and what needs to be changed regarding our foreign policy, because this is happening in our name. When they go to war, they say the United States. Well, I live in the United States, and I'm anti-war. And we need to make a radical change. But that can't come if we don't have a unified people. And I'm hoping that everybody in this room can agree. Now, we could disagree on certain trivial things, but we can all agree that our foreign policy is a disaster and that it's being shaped by madmen. And we need to make the change necessary in order to save ourselves from ourselves. to save human life, not just here, but to the countries we bomb. Thank you for coming. Have a good night. See you at the next live discussion.